Chapter 4 Chaucer, Gowers, Piers, Plowman. Geoffrey Chaucer, who was born in the early 1340s and died in 1400, marks the brilliant culmination of Middle English literature. He had the metrical craftsmanship to handle English with a subtlety, a flexibility, and a polish which made it at once the equal, as a literary language, of French or Italian. He had the European consciousness, too, to enable him to render in English the dominant themes and attitudes of European literature, and at the same time the English national consciousness to allow him to present the English scene as it had never been presented before. He had the relaxed, quizzical attitude that let him contemplate the varieties of human nature with a combination of sympathy, irony, and amusement. Together with the good fortune to have opportunities of knowing men in all ranks of society, he was trained in the courtly life, the diplomatic life, and the urban life of affairs. His visits to France and Italy on government service gave him an opportunity of coming into direct contact with French and Italian men of letters and enriching his knowledge of the literature of those countries. He was, in fact, fitted by both natural genius and the circumstances of his life to become the most universally appealing of medieval English writers, and indeed one of the most skillful and attractive of English writers of any period. With Chaucer, the English language and English writers of any period. With Chaucer, the English language and English literature grew up. The gradual process of recovery and refinement which the English language had been undergoing since it emerged after the conquest in rough popular rendering of French romances was now complete. It was a happy accident that the man who had the technical brilliance in the metrical handling of language also had the breadth of view, the knowledge, the interests, the experience of life, and largeness of sympathy to enable him, in the latter part of his poetic career, to embody his great secular vision of his fellow men in brilliant literary form. He used the intellectual and imaginative resources of the Middle Ages, not, as Dante did, to present a great concrete embodiment of the moral and theological universe in which medieval man lived, but to bring alive with vividness and cunning the psychological and social world of his time, which turns out to be also the world of our own and every other time. Chaucer, to whom, it must be remembered, French was a language as familiar as English, early absorbed the courtly love tradition as represented by the somewhat over-stylized French poets of his own time. He knew and drew on the poetry of Guillaume de Macaut, Jean Froissart, and Eustace de Champs, and he was thoroughly familiar with, and, at least in part, translated, the Romance of the Rose, the source of so much 14th-century French poetry, and especially of Macaut's sophisticated exercises in the conventions of courtly love. The Dream Allegory had by now become the standard method of entering into a poem. The waking dream, where the sleeper wanders into a garden on a May morning, gay with blossoming flowers and the singing of birds, and there encounters the characters who tell him their love affairs or lament their misfortunes in love or act out their story, derives from the Romance of the Rose, but is now treated with a sophistication, a formal manipulation of standard properties, with heraldic colors and shapes and a highly wrought surface finish, of which neither the fresh vision of Guillaume de Loris nor the encyclopedic and more cynical mind of Jean de Meum was capable. Guillaume's brightly pictured characters dancing in the garden and Jean's learned misogynistic digressions mingle in Chaucer's early poetry, presented in narrative frameworks and with picturesque detail which owe a considerable amount to Macaut and others. But the debt is simply an indication that Chaucer is working in a European tradition. As he developed, he was to draw on more and more aspects of that tradition. As he developed, he was to draw on more and more of that aspects of the tradition and to make a more and specifically English use of it. His visits to Italy in 1372–73 and in 1378 brought him into contact with the work of Dante, Boccaccio, and Petrarch, and this widened and deepened his literary resources and encouraged him to seek wider fields than the formal garden of Guillaume de Loris. And all the time his career as courtier, man of affairs, and civil servant, for Chaucer was a bourgeois with courtly connections and thus had the freedom of at least two social worlds, brought him into contact with people of all ranks and professions to provide increasing opportunities for his clear-eyed observation of his fellow men.
Chaucer was thus brought up on the Rose tradition and on later French developments of it before moving to the deeper seriousness of Italian poetry. The ritual dance of an idealized courtly life, with its emphasis on gentilesse and franchise nobility and generosity of character, gives way to larger concern with the fundamentals of human character and behavior, and this, in turn, moves into contemplation, both delighted and ironical, of the foibles, vanities, absurdities, pretensions, villainies of men as he knew them. But it would be gross simplification of Chaucer's literary career to trace it merely from an imitative formalism through a greater seriousness and flexibility to subtle and realistic psychological observation, conventionally symbolized by reference to his French, Italian, and English periods. From an early stage he was free of a wider world of books than is suggested by any of these categories. What the Middle Ages knew of the classical world, its history, its mythology, its literature, Chaucer knew. What it knew of astronomy, astrology, medicine, theology, philosophy, he knew as well as a layman could. And it is not the least testimony to his genius that his poetry gives us the richest picture in English of how the ancient world of Greece and Rome appeared to the medieval imagination. Its curiously transmuted image mingling with patristic thought, scholastic categories, and popular beliefs to produce an attitude to man in the world which is still an important part of the Western tradition. If the romance of the Rose and the poetry of Macaut and Froissart and Deschamps were important part of the Western tradition, if the romance of the Rose and the poetry of Macaut and Froissart and Deschamps were important to him, so were Virgil's Aeneid, Ovid's Heroides and Metamorphoses, Lucan's Pharsalia, Statius the Bede, Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophiae, which he translated, Macrobius's commentary on the Somnium Scipionis of Cicero, the Troy stories of Des Phrygius and Dictys Cretensis, and of later writers. Pope Innocent III's The Contemptu Mundi, which he apparently also translated, and much patristic literature, to say nothing of the Vulgate, the Latin liturgy of the Church. Vast numbers of medieval romances and a miscellaneous assortment of medieval scientific, religious, historical, and entertaining works. This assorted reading blended in his mind, as it did in the minds of his contemporaries, to produce a world of the imagination in which Pluto and his queen, Proserpina, and Alhaiafeye can meet in a walled garden made by a merchant, a garden so fair that he, the true romance of the Rose, the accord of it, the beauties well device, and quote to each other, just as Philoseric, author of Ecclesiasticus, and this Jew, this Slayman, i.e., King Solomon. Classical myth transposed into the key of medieval folklore and seen against a background of biblical story and in an ethical context which includes the courtly notion of gentilesse, Christian ideals of virtue, and a robust acceptance of human weakness and absurdity in the fabliau tradition. This is typical of Chaucer and of the civilization for which he spoke. In this sense Chaucer is 14th century, and his work gives us a vivid insight into the 14th century world, but in his art he transcended the bounds of his time, so that he illuminates his background rather than allows his background, if we have learned it, to illuminate him. We need make no historical allowances for Chaucer at all, for he fully justifies his picture of the world by the literary uses to which he puts it. He is perhaps the first English poet known by name for whom this claim can be made unreservedly. Chaucer's first narrative poem, The Book of the Daiches, is in the Dream Allegory convention and draws considerably on Macaut. It was written at the end of 1369 on the death of Blanche, Duchess of Lancaster, to celebrate the dead woman and console the bereaved duke. In a dream the poet sees a man in black in a wood, who tells him of his courtship of his beautiful lady and ends by revealing that his present mourning is for her death. This ingenious adaptation of the dream allegory for the twin purpose of eulogy and elegy is already straining out of its conventional framework. The interest less in the poem by the current of psychological curiosity that runs through it. The octosyllabic couplets move easily enough,
though without the combination of control and variety that characterizes Chaucer's mature verse, and they begin by presenting a picture of the poet suffering from anismania, reading the story of Ceyx and Alcyone in Ovid to while away his sleepless night. He tells the story with speed and economy, lingering only on an occasional detail that will add vividness. As when Juno's messenger comes to Morpheus, the god of sleep, this messenger came clean gay fast and cried, "Zero, hoy awake moon, it was for no, they heard it I am none. Awake, quod he, Vuyas light there, and blew his horn right in here, and cried, Awake. Having told TBE's story, he goes on to describe how he settled down to sleep, hoping that Chilke Morpheus, Lor Hys Goddessi, Dame Juno Io Sam Vitals, Ine Rote who would send him sleep. And offering Morpheus a feather bed, YIFEWOL make me sleepy AIYTE. He finally falls asleep and dreams that he wakes to find himself in bed on a May morning with the birds singing sweetly. The windows of his room attract his attention, for Holial the story of Troy was in the Glasingiro thus of Hector and of King Priamus, of Achilles and Laomedon, and eke of Medea and of Jason, of Paris Helene and of Lavine, and in the valleys with colours fine were painted, both text and gloss of all the romance of the rose. This is the world in which the poem moves. The poet goes outside into a wood and finds a hunt in progress. On inquiring from a huntsman who is hunting here, he is told Syr. Thom less than JROUR Octavian, an answer which seems somehow appropriate in the trance-like atmosphere of the dream, with its stylized heraldic scenery. The hunt is forgotten when the poet comes upon the Black Knight, whose lamentations leave the poet rather stupidly puzzled as to their cause. Chaucer, and this was to be a frequent device with him, makes himself out to be somewhat obtuse. And even when the knight goes into a description of his courtship of his lady, he does not realize that it is the loss of the lady that now causes his grief. After the account of his wooing and winning his love done with a grave and formal beauty in spite of its use of the conventional courtly love properties, the poet asks where the lady is now. And the knight falls into lamentation again. Still the poet is puzzled. Alas, sir, how? What may that be? She is deady, Nile, Yis, be my troudal, is that your lass? Be God, Hyts Ruthal. At this moment the hunt returns, the nearby castle bell strikes 12, and the poet awakes to find the book with the story of Ceyx and Alcyone by her side. Chaucer has succeeded in infusing some slight element of psychological and dramatic liveliness into this formal, visionary elegy. But the world of the poem is trance-like and its forms and colors heraldic. With the House of Fame, which is probably Chaucer's next work, we move out of the world of trance. Though the framework is still the dream, the influence of Dante's Divina Commedia is clear in the second and third of the three parts, but the mood of the poem is far from Dantesque. Book 1 opens with a discussion of dreams, a subject on which Chaucer was much given to speculation, and proceeds to describe a dream in which he found himself in a temple of glass. It was of Venus. Read Ali. The temple, on whose walls was engraved the story of the Aeneid, with special emphasis, as always in the medieval treatment of the Aeneid, on the Dido episode, which Chaucer is in 140 lines. This leads him to give a conventional list of faithless lovers, Ovidian in origin, before continuing the story up to Aeneas' marriage with Lavinia. The incidents are presented as a series of pictures introduced by the formula, Dorso I then saw one. Coming out of the temple doors he sees a golden eagle shining in the sky. At the opening of Book 2 the eagle, having descended, seizes the poet in its claws and bears him aloft. With this, the mood of the poem changes from the visionary to the lively, humorous and colloquial. The poet describes his fright, the eagle's reassuring words and subsequent conversation. The eagle explains to Chaucer that he is taking him to the house of Fme. For the poet is a dull fellow who knows nothing of his neighbors. There we will learn of love tidings and of all the jealousies, fears and hypocrisies of men. The eagle lectures the unhappy man, whom he addresses familiarly as Gary, on acoustics, explaining how all speech eventually reaches the House of Fame. and prides himself on his ability to explain difficult scientific matters simply to an ignorant man. The poet replies in implicatory monosyllables. Nothing can stop the flow of the eagle's didactic talk, which continues until he lands the poet on the steep slope below the House of Fame. Bucil, beginning with an invocation to God of Science and of Ivyght, imitated from Book 1 of Dante's Paradiso, goes on to describe the poet's difficult ascent to the House of Fame, which was situated on a high rock of clear ice. The names of many famous people were engraved on this rock, but some letters of every name had melted away. On the other side he saw names of famous persons of antiquity, and they were still as fresh as ever. The castle itself is made of beryl stone, and Chaucer's account of what he saw there is a crowded collection of deliberately incongruous detail, presented with an air of null wonder. In the hall he saw statues of Josephus and Daiches, Homer, Des Phrygius, Daiches Cretensis, Guido della Colonna, Geoffrey of Monmouth, Virgil, Ovid, Venus, Clark, Lucan, c. Lucan, Tildodian, who wrote the Rap to Proserpine, among others, and then a large company of the people swarmed in, beseeching the goddess of fame to grant them her favor. And some of ham she granted sane, and some she werned way and fair, and some she granted the contrary of her axing outly. But thus I say ye you, truly, what her cause was why nasty. Another group ask for good fame and get the reverse, a third ask for it and receive it, a fourth group of well-doers do not wish for fame and receive the oblivion they seek. A fifth group with a similar request receive immortal fame, a sixth group of idlers seek the good fame of active heroes and receive it, a seventh in a similar position are refused it. A group of people guilty of treachery ask for good fame and are denied it. Finally, a group of cheerful and self-satisfied evildoers ask for fame as evildoers, which is granted them. All this is done with sounding of trumpets, crying of heralds, and much lively ceremonial. Chaucer, though he is still in the world of medieval dream allegory, is beginning to enjoy himself in a new way. After fame has disposed of the final group, a man turns to the poet and asks, "Friend, what is thy name? Art thou come hide up to her fame?" Chaucer hastily disclaims any such intention, and says he is there to learn some new tidings. The man takes him out of the House of Fame to the House of Rumour, a building of twigs more strangely wrought than the famous labyrinth built by Daedalus. This cage-like building, full of holes to let the sound out, seethes with the noise of rumors of all kinds. As the poet wonders at the strange place, he sees his eagle perched on a stone nearby, and I gan straight to him gone, and said thus, "Why pray that thou awhile abide me, for God's love, and let me seen what wonders in this place been, Petra, that is my and Anton," quod he to me. Precisely why I am here, in fact, and the eagle takes him up to a window, where he hears people reporting gossip to each other. Each man tells his neighbor, and so the tidings grow and spread until they go out by the holes in the house to come to fame. Who determines their future duration? The poem ends abruptly, unfinished, with the poets discerning a man who seemed fit to be a man of great talk to write. With these words the poem ends. Presumably, the man of great authority was to announce some important tidings, which may or may not have been the nominal reason they treated of the poem. A strange mélange of a poem. The dream and the allegorical belong to a hackneyed enough convention, but the poem strikes notes that had not before been struck in English. The conversation of the eagle in Book 2, with its quizzical humor, the poet laughing both at himself and at the loquacious and self-important bird, and some of the detail of action and conversation in the crowded book, let a fresh wind into the medieval garden of poetry. Echoes of Dante add occasional overtones of high seriousness, but the comic tone predominates, even though the poet touches now and again on some of the most profound of human problems. The versification has a sureness and flexibility that the Book of the Duchess lacks, while the handling of dialogue would itself justified the claim that the House of Fame is one of the important transitional poems in English, pointing forward to far-reaching developments in the presentation of character and conversation in fiction, but that this began to cry, "Ludwig quod he thy fantasy."
Wilt thou let stairs ought? Nay, certainly. Quod why not, and why? For why am now too old, else I would have told. Quod he. The stairs names 10. And all the heavens signethert tilde nd which t tilde y ben no fours. Quod why? Yis padil quod he was to why. Bugnell learn. The Parliament of Fowls is probably Chaucer's next major poem. It, too, is in the dream convention, but elements from both Dante and Boccaccio now enrich the style and the content. The verse form is the 7-line stanza rhyming above BCC. Known as Rhyme Royal because of its later use by James I of Scotland in his King's Square, if James I really was the author. And Chaucer handles it with a poise and a liquid row of language that is something new in Middle English. The leaf so short, the craft so long to yen, the say so hard, so sharp and conquerange. The dreadful joy alway that slit so yem all this many I by love that my felon Chaucer, Gower, Piers Plowman astonieth with his wonderful work in so iwis, that when I owsOhym thank. Not what I wear that I hate osinke. He goes on to say, and this is typical of Chaucer's combination of gravity with irony, that he himself knows love not from experience but from books. He had been reading, he says, the Somnium Scipionis as interpreted by Macrobius, which he proceeds to summarize. After a comment on the significance of old books, which gives us a vivid insight into Chaucer's attitude toward his reading, for out of oide fells, as men saith, cometh all this nave come from year to year. And out of old books in good fytb, cometh all this oewe science that men learn. Old books and personal observation, experience and auctority to us tilde Chaucer's terms are the two sources of knowledge and understanding. And for Chaucer, character was largely determined by the use an individual makes of each. For the wife of Bath, experience was to be enough experience, though no auctority were in this world. Is right enough for me, enough at least to tell her all she needed to know about marriage, though the lady was not averse to reinforcing her conclusions with copious reference to authorities. In Chaucer's own literary career, the relation between literary sources and personal observation keeps shifting. It is not that he moves from the former to the latter, no writer moves simply from literature to life. However much more simply derivative his earlier work may be than his later, but he finds more original and richer ways of combining the two elements and allowing each to illuminate the other. Like the House of Fame, the Parliament of Fowls imposes the author's personality on conventional material. A graver utterance from Dante and picturesque descriptions from Boccaccio's Teesside, which he was to draw on more extensively in The Knight's Tale, are part of the new literary materials he assimilates in the Parliament, which in its narrative outline and its theme are wholly conventional. After reading the Somnium Scipionis, the poet goes to bed, as daylight is failing, the day gan felon, and the dirk nyght that reveth pests from here busyness. Berra flami my bok lolico one lyle. This echoes Dante's Lo giorno se tilde indiva areri Bruno togliverli animece sono intera dane fatish loro. And there are several other such echoes throughout the poem. They are all subdued to the mood of the poem, and the mood itself is deftly modulated through several different keys. Sleep produces its dream, in which, after a Dantesque journey with Scipio Africanus as his guide, cannot I say if that the cause were I, for I had read of African Byphon. That made me to meet dream, that he stood there, he comes to a garden by a river, with the usual birds singing, and the usual allegorical characters disporting themselves. Cupid, plaisance, courtesy, delete, gentilesse, beauty, youth, flattery, douceur, and others. It is yet another picture of the ubiquitous garden of the rose tradition, but described freshly enough for all that. He sees the temple of Venus, too, with its appropriate characters, and comes at last to a beautiful soft green place where the goddess Nature, on a hill of flowers, was presiding over a great congress of birds. This was St. Valentine's Day, and the birds had assembled to choose their mates in accordance with nature's rule. 3 noble eagles claimed the hand of the beautiful female eagle perched on the goddess's wrist, and each of the 3, in descending order of rank, CRG equals the 4 RMELC JGJESH.IS. HR 3.DEJT greater than PNPC CMT TJYLDV tens. Then the mass of birds take up the debate. Many opound them have little patience with the niceties of courtly love. The goose in particular laughing at the notion of constancy to a beloved who does not love in return but she volove hym love another. The sparrow Hatilda Kentum scorns the goose's vulgar attitude. Lo, hear a perfect resound of a goose, he exclaims contemptuously. The turtle dove defends constancy, and the argument grows into a magnificent hubbub until nature silences them all. MD gives her verdict that after waiting a year the formal eagle should make her choice. Then the birds sing a roundel for St. Valentine's Day, to don to nature honor and pleasance before flying away, and the poet wakes. The Parliament of Fowls is thus a poem in celebration of St. Valentine's Day, using the convention of the Dream Allegory and the Demande d'amour. It may also have been prompted by saint-specific royal courtship, and scholars have spilt much ink in debating which one. But any contemporary reference is irrelevant to the true significance of the poem, which is a deftly handled occasional piece showing Chaucer's growing mastery of his medium. His ability to impose his own tone on conventional material. The mood shifts easily from one of quiet gravity through an occasional flash of irony to a lively and humorous realism. To end on a note of happy celebration. Plowman Crusade, written probably in the middle 1380s, is a major work in which the full genius of Chaucer as metrical technician, as storyteller, and as student of human character is triumphantly displayed. It is in a sense the first real novel in English. It tells a love story with a delicacy of psychological awareness, a brilliant handling of detail, a firm sense of structure, and a mastery of controlled digression. The verse, which is the rhyme royal stanza, again adapts itself easily to the changing demands of the narrative, and its liquid how seems to increase the sense of fate and inevitability which hangs over the action throughout. Its immediate source is Boccaccio's Tu Filostrator, but, while taking the main action and many specific incidents from Boccaccio, he expands the simple, highly colored, fast-moving Italian story of love and betrayal into a multidimensional work, subtle in psychology, more varied in detail, and richer in moral overtones. Behind the Filostrato lies the curious and characteristically medieval transmutation of a couple of minor Homeric characters who originally have no connection with each other at all, into the familiar story of Troilus' love for Cressida, his winning of her, and her eventual desertion of him for the Greek Diomed. Homer's Briseis and Chryseis were Trojan captives whose disposal helped to produce the wrath of Achilles. There's Phrygius, whose importance for the medieval view of the Troy story we have noted gives brief character sketches of Trojas, Diomed and Briseis, but does not bring them together in a story. Benvad the Saint Amour's Roman the Twa makes Briseida the daughter of Calchas the Trojan seer who deserted to the Greeks on foreseeing their ultimate victory, and makes Troilus in love with her. But the only part of the story he dwells on is the winning of her love by Diomed after she has been sent to join her father among the Greeks. Guido della Colonna in his Historia Troiana follows Benva, Briseis and Chryseis eventually coalesces Cressida, later Cressida, and Boccaccio is the first to tell the story of Troilus and Cressida, now so familiar. Boccaccio dedicates his poem to the lady whom he loves and who has left him, as a memorial of your worth and of my sadness, and it has a personal, lyrical, youthful tone through tilde out. He first introduces Pandarus, whom he makes the brother of Cressida and contemporary of Troilus, a young man who brings his sister and his friend together out of his friendship for the latter. Chaucer's Pandar is Boccaccio's Pandaro in function but not in character or behavior. He is Chryside's uncle as well as Troilus' friend, evidently an older man, much given to quoting proverbs and precedents, a shrewd, good-natured worldly wise, affectionate man who shows infinite resource in bringing the lovers together but who is helpless in the face of the final tragedy. Chaucer's Troilus is the perfect gentle knight, not substantially different from Boccaccio's Troja, but Chaucer's Cressida is drawn with a psychological subtlety that makes her into a wholly new character. She is the first truly complex heroine in post-classical European literature.
This development of a story which grew up within the framework of the Troy story throws interesting light not only on the medieval perspective on the classical world but also on Chaucer's methods and on the way in which his imagination worked. The Middle Ages had not the sense of literary property that we now have, and there was nothing improper in Chaucer's taking Boccaccio's story as a basis for his own. He had done that sort of thing before and was to do it again. On that story Chaucer brought to bear both experience and auctority, his own knowledge of human nature and his wide reading. The conception of the Wheel of Fortune, ever turning so that the individual is now up now down, and the whole problem of fate and free will as discussed by Boethius pervade the poem. Boethius is more than once paraphrased at length. Dante, Petrarch and Ovid are drawn on for lines or images or situations. Indeed, a whole world of reading is domiciled in the richly textured narrative. And Chaucer's own insight and humor and irony and sympathy play over all. The Trojan War is the background. A medievalized Troy is presented to us in very detail, with the classical properties somehow made to fit a medieval way of life. Sallies out from the city walls against the besieging Greeks are daily occurrences, a constant opportunity for the performance of knightly deeds. We see Troilus first, the gay young knight scornful of love, and then Cressida, the demure young widow, standing in the temple at a Religious festival in her black habit. Troilus sees her there and is suddenly smitten. He has fallen in love in church, as it were. Cressida is the very perfection of womanhood. She knows not with the test of high stature, betilde in high James so we answer injuring to womanhood. That creature was never las manus in semenge. And eke the pure wise of high Mevan showed way that men may in high Jesse honor estat and womanly noblesse. To Troilus right wonder well with Algan for to like higher Mevan and higher Ahere, which som Deldanus was, for she let for a higher Ucalite aside in Swihimanate essences. What the first of me I not stand in here? Troilus at once feels all the woes of the courtly lover. He automatically assumes that his beloved is unattainable, infinitely superior to him in every way. The cheerful, bustling, proverb-quoting Pandre finds him lamenting in bed. And after much vivid talk it is remarkable how Chaucer can give the very accent of conversation in verse gets his secret from him. When it turns out that Troilus is in love, and with Pandar's niece, Pandre has no doubt that all can be managed. This is courtly love tilde, and it must be secret and outside marriage, free from scandal and the breath of wicked tongues. The contradiction at the heart of the courtly love notion, that love is supremely honorable yet the lady's reputation is injured if it be known, comes out clearly in the poem. More is involved than the winning of Cressida's love. She must first be brought to lay aside her fears for her reputation and be reassured that everything can be done with discretion. Those fears are particularly strong in Cressida's case, for she is in a difficult position as well as fearful by nature. Her father is a traitor who has deserted to the other side, and she therefore must be especially careful in her behavior. Pandre has his work cut out. Meanwhile Troilus, reassured by Pandre, rouses himself and performs deeds of great valor against the Greeks. For courtly love ennobles the character and makes the heart more brave and generous, for he bycom the errandliest vitae, the gentlest, and eke the most afraid, the thriftiest, and on the best knee that in his time was or might be. Dead were his japes and his herulte, his haput and his manere stronge, and ECCH of Dogan for a very chonge. Book 2 opens on a note of hope. Echoing the opening of the Purgatorio, Chaucer begins OWT of Thighs Blake was for to say AOWYOD 0 wind. The weather Jeanette Claire. This book is taken up with the maneuverings of Pandre. He visits his niece and after a bantering conversation to put her in a good mood, he begins to warm up to his news, eventually rousing her to such a pitch of suspense that she can hardly wait to hear it. He then tells her of Troilus' love, saying that he asks only that she take pity on the young man and be nice to him, else he will die of love. And if Troilus dies, Pandre will die too. She reacts unfavorably at first. She is afraid of scandal. She is afraid of losing her independent way of life as a widow. She is afraid, it appears,
of committing herself to any such relationship because it will mean adventuring out of her unaccustomed and comfortable single existence. But she is interested and, in spite of herself, excited. "Can he speak of love?" she eventually asks her uncle, who then began to smile, for he knew the first round was won. And when Troilus, fresh from a victorious encounter with the Greeks, rides by her window amid the cheers of the crowd, she looks out and sees his handsome and knightly figure and his modest bearing, and letteth so soft and high hearts in K, that to herself she said, "Who if me dream K?" But the siege is far from over. With a subtle combination of real reluctance and concern for appearances, both of which cover a genuine excitement about Troilus, she concedes little at first, and has to have her defenses broken down one by one. The story of TFLL's breaking down to form to thus satisfactorily some of ZFS, a brilliant piece of psychological fiction. The question of the genuineness of Chrysaid's reluctance can still arouse here dead argument among the critics, which is sufficient testimony to Chaucer's skill in character drawing. Chrysaid is, in fact, the first character in English literature whose character is argued over as though she were a real person. First she is persuaded to receive and to answer a letter from Troilus. Then Pandre, by an ingenious device, brings them together briefly, but long enough to allow Troilus to offer and Chrysaid to accept him with the ambiguous proviso myn on us off. Finally, Pandre invites Chrysaid to dinner when rain is expected. The heavy rain prevents her from going home and he gives her a bed in his house. Of course Troilus is there. He is supposed to have arrived suddenly, out of his wits, because he has heard that Chrysaid has been having an affair with someone else. Pandre runs Troilus to Chrysaid's bedside and he explains his fears. She reproaches him for them so violently that he faints. Pandre heaves him into Chrysaid's bed and after further maneuvering leaves him to be restored by Chrysaid. Chrysaid is now caught, or is it Troilus? Pandre is gone, taking the candle with him, with the remark that it isn't good for sick folks' eyes. And Chrysaid, when Troilus calls on her to yield at last, she answers passionately in his arms, "Any hatiara now, my sweet hatia, benyoid, ywis, I were now not here." And a night of passion follows, described by Chaucer vividly but not costly. His account of the lovers' wonder in each other is done with the fine psychological realism. The morning follows, and the Obad, the song of love, is reluctantly parting at dawn. Thus Troilus and Chrysaid become lovers and continue to love secretly and happily until fortune's wheel turns again. This brings us to the beginning of Book 4, which tells of the exchange of prisoners and the decision to send Chrysaid to her father in the Greek camp in return for Antenor. The distress of the lovers, Troilus' bitter speculations on fate, their final night together with their railings on fate and vows of eternal constancy take up most of the book. Troilus proposes that they steal away together, but Chrysaid dismisses the plan as dangerous and impracticable. She fears scandal. She promises that she will contrive to get back to Troy on the 10th day after her departure, but of course she does not come. And the fifth book moves from Troilus to Chrysaid, showing the state of mind of each. Chrysaid is led to the Greek camp by Diomed, handsome, self-confident, unscrupulous, and experienced lady's man. He lays siege to her at once, and she, fearful among strangers, glad to have his protection to fall back on, unable to face the dangers of the return to Troy, and taking the line of least resistance, accepts him as a lover. In Troy the line of least resistance had been to remain in her single wedded state in the Greek camp, friendless and bewildered. Acceptance of Diomed is the easy way. For all her good qualities, she was slight and of courage, she lacked willpower. She repulses Diomed's first attempt with the "not yet," which already shows that the game is up. And when she yielded to him, she said to herself pathetically, "But sin I say there is no better way till and that too late is now for me to reway to Diomed Algate IWOLBTRWE." As for Chaucer, ne meaningless the says EIY woman chide farther than the story WOL Davies. Higher name alias is punished so wide that for higher guilt it enough suffice. And if I might excuse higher anywise, for she so sorry was for hire in troth I would excuse hire yet for Ruth.
Troilus waits for her return in vain, the picture of him waiting day after day until dusk at the city gates, making excuses for her delay, thinking he sees her in the distance only to find that it is a fair traveling cart, is one of the most poignant and perfectly wrought things in English literature. At last he writes and receives a loving but suspiciously evasive answer. And finally he finds on a cloak taken from Diomede the brooch that he himself had given to Cressida, and he knows for certain what he had for some time suspected. With nothing to live for, he becomes bold and cruel in battle and is eventually slain by Achilles. The poem concludes with the picture of Troilus' spirit looking down from above at this tiny world, and laughing at the shabby human scene with its distracting emotions. Such fyn hath 10 this Troilus falleth, such end such fyn hath all his great worthiness. Such fyn hath false world's brutalness. The end of the poem is religious, an appeal from human love to divine love, with a sonorous devotional stanza from the Paradiso to conclude. The literary greatness and historical significance of Troilus and Cressida lie in the way Chaucer has presented and enriched the narrative. It has more dimensions than anything that had hitherto appeared in English. Some of the most important effects are lost in a summary, the touches of humorous realism in the conversation of Pandre, particularly in his talk with his niece, the hashes of amused or ironic perception, the subtle discernment of character in all its phases, the moral and philosophical overtones, the adroit use of his reading to achieve these overtones, and the how and hexability of the steadily moving verse. The English prose novel was well advanced before anything comparable was to appear in English literature. In The Legend of Good Women, Chaucer returns to the love vision for his framework. This unfinished work is a somewhat tiresome collection of accounts of loving and faithful women, including Cleopatra, Medetilda, Lucrece, Ariadne, Philomela, and others, which Chaucer explains was required of him as a penance by the god of love for having written heresies against love's law, and particularly for having drawn the character of a faithless woman in Troilman Cressida. The legends themselves, constructed on the analogy of that common medieval form, the legendary or collection of saints' lives, seem to have been written without any great enthusiasm, and there is nothing in them approaching the art of the Troilus. But the prologue to The Legend of Good Women, which exists in two interestingly different versions, has a charm and liveliness that the body of the work lacks. It opens with a sprightly discussion of the relation between book knowledge and experience. 1,000 times have I heard men tell that Tahar yas joy in heaven and pain in hell, and I accord well that it is so, but natheless yet what I weigh also that Tahar is noon dwelling in this country, that either hath in heaven or hell be, nay may of hit noon otherwise within. But as he hath heard said or found at Triton, we must trust old books in matters of which nobody has direct experience. The poet himself reverences them so heartily that Tahar is game noon that raw my bakes maketh me to goon, but yet be seldom on the holy day, save certainly when that the month of May is come in, and that I hear the fowlers sunge, and that the flores gin and lotus springe. Farewell my book and my devotional. And then Chaucer turns to a description of the conventional May morning of the rose tradition. But it is done with a freshness and a sprightly charm that raises it far above most of the hundreds of other such descriptions in medieval literature. This freshness and sense of personal delight in the world of growing things which we find in the prologue is all the more remarkable when we consider that not only is the setting conventional, but the theme which he goes on to elaborate, the worship of the daisy, is itself bound up with the literary fashion of his time in the passage celebrating the daisy is based on a poem by Duchamp. By his choice of images, by the limpid flow of the couplets, by his cunning distribution of pauses and emphasis, Chaucer gives new life and conviction to this traditional material. The appearance in the meadow of the god of love and his queen also occurs in the dream which he has after falling asleep in the open. The god reproaches him for his heresies against love. Ulster defends him and seeks to soften her lord's anger, and the result is that he is given the penance of writing the stories of faithful women betrayed by false men. The task, however, was one which Chaucer's genius had outgrown. He must have been already thinking of the plan of the Canterbury Tales, that magnificent unfinished opus in which he finally drew the various strands of his genius together.
What more perfect wedding of authority and experience of books and life than a collection of true-to-life pilgrims drawn from every class of contemporary Englishmen who, to while away the hours of journeying, tell tales drawn from whatever literary or folk source seems most appropriate to the individual character? Some of the tales had been written before the plan to link them through the pilgrimage device had been thought of. The second nun's tale, for example, the legend of Saint Cecilia, is early, as are the tragedies used in the Monk's Tale and the Knight's Tale, a reworking of Boccaccio's Tesside probably done about the same time as the Trailers. The general prologue, which establishes the characters and sets the scene, probably dates from the late 1380s, and the whole scheme, 2 stories from each pilgrim on the outward journey, and to each again on the return, was far from complete when Chaucer died. But the real purpose of the scheme was to give Chaucer the opportunity of welding his observation of men with his literary knowledge, and that purpose could be achieved without the completion of the total plan. The scheme was thus not so much a literary form in itself as a device for giving new life to other literary forms. A group of linked tales told by different people was not unknown in earlier medieval literature, and scholars have come up with various parallels, of which perhaps the closest is the novel of Giovanni Surcombi, where the setting is also a pilgrimage. Daiches, the author himself, one of the pilgrims, tells all the tales. It is doubtful whether Chaucer knew Boccaccio's Decameron, but Chaucer's work is unique in its individualizing of the narrators and in the whole sense of the contemporary social scene which he brings to the reader. He brings together at the tabernacle the representatives of every class in the England of his day, except, it should be noted, the very highest and the very lowest. There is no one higher than the knight or lower than the plowman, who is a tenant farmer and not a tied laborer. Each pilgrim is at once a fully realized individual and a representative of his class or his profession. They are on holiday, not at their daily labors, so that they are more relaxed and self-revealing than they would otherwise be. Further, only on a pilgrimage could such a heterogeneous collection of people of different social status be brought together. The characters move between the inn and the shrine, the 2 places where different classes are likely to mingle. But their daily lives, their normal habits of thinking, their prejudices, professional bias, most familiar ideas, and personal idiosyncrasies gone out in their conversation and their behavior. They are more than a framework, their conduct affects and is affected by the telling of the tales. The prologue, which describes them one by one, takes up the details that would strike the eye of a fellow traveler. There is a deliberately contrived disorder in the way in which the facts about each character are brought to our attention. For example, he describes the cook's skill in boiling, roasting, grilling, and frying, then remarks, "But great harm was it, as it thought Amy Nat on his china morrow her day he wrote for blank manga, that made he with the best." The afterthought about the blank manga, an elaborate cream dish, gives an air of absolute naturalness to the description. And this air of innocent observation the author, as fellow pilgrim, naively noting what he sees or learns about the others in the casual order which occurs to him, can be put to most effective ironic uses when Chaucer so desires. It is worth noting, too, how more than once he begins a new description on the second line of a couplet. Thus the first line of the shipman's description follows immediately on the last line of the description of the cook. For blank manga, that made he with the best. A shipman was tahir, worn and fed by waste, for aught I woot he was of the mouth. This again gives an air of naturalness and spontaneity. A good example of both these devices is in the description of the monk, followed by that of the friar. The account of the monk concludes, "Now certainly he was a fair preachart, he was not pale as a four-pine ghost. A fat swan loved he best of any roost. His porray was as brown as is a berry. A friar was a wanton and a merry." The color of the monk's horse comes in casually at the end of his description, as though the author had just noticed it, and then the friar is introduced in the same couplet. Chaucer's naivety as observer is assumed for purposes of irony. Nothing could be more perfectly done than the description of the prioress. It is mere innocent observation, it seems, until we discover that the details add up to an amused picture of a nun whose real interest in life was to affect genteel behavior. Tahir was also a nun, a prioress. That of Esmeling was full simple and coy. Higher greatest death was but by Saint Eloi, and she was ylept Madame Eglantine. Full wheel she sung the service divine, and tuned in her nose full seemly. And French she spak full fair and fetisly, after the skill of Stratford Alterbo, for French of Paris was to hire no. At Mitway taught was she with ile. She let no morsel from her lips fail, nay wet her finger in her sauce tape, we coddy she carry a morsel and we cape that no drop navy upon her breast. In courtesy was set Olati Louis shall hit lest. Here over lippy wiped she so see one in that in her copper taher was no furthing sen of grace when she drunken had day her draughty. Full seemly after her meat she rotty. Only the knight, the poor parson and the plowman are treated without any touch of irony at all as almost ideal figures. And it is significant that they are all something like anachronisms by Chaucer's time. The knight represents the highest ideals of chivalry and courtesy. The poor parson's genuinely Christian behavior is implicitly contrasted with that of the other representatives of the church, and the plowman, honest, hard-working, good-hearted, would be hard to find in the age of the peasants' revolt in the statute of laborers. These perhaps nostalgic portraits represent Chaucer's obli.k comment on the troubles of his time, which he never overtly discusses. It is worth remembering what would not be guessed from his study of Chaucer's writings that the period in which he lived was a time of rapid change and even of confusion. The growing tendency for the commutation of labor service for money payment combined with the results of the Black Death to cause the decay of villanage and to increase the independence of the laborers, who, left small in number by the ravages of the plague, were able to set their own price on their labor. In vain the governing class tried to stop the rise in laborers' wages by statutes of laborers. The clock could not be put back, and the results of the Black Death in depopulating the countryside put the laborers in an extremely favorable position. Villains slipped away from the land to which they were legally bound to offer their services to the highest bidder. With harvests rotting for lack of workers, landowners were forced to pay in wages till the hat was asked. In addition to the unrest produced by this problem, there were many other causes for general dissatisfaction in the last years of Edward II's reign and the beginning of Richard II's. England was being governed by a selfish and corrupt clique. France was slipping away from her control and her supremacy at sea being steadily destroyed. The glory of Cressy and Poitiers had departed, and worst of all, the country was being taxed almost out of existence in a vain endeavour to win back the lost power and glory. English commerce depended largely on the maintenance of English sea power, and the revival of French might by land and sea was more than a military question. Amid this general discontent, the peasants' revolt broke out in 1381. Change was in the air, and to a contemporary it might well have seemed to be decay. Chivalry had become a farce. Every kind of magnificence was to be seen in the state of the small minority who wielded the power, while disease and misery prevailed throughout the countryside. The state had grown lopsided. When the Black Prince took Limoges in 1370, he massacred all the citizens, enfilading hundreds of women and children. Yet he treated the few knights who were in the town with exaggerated kindness and courtesy. In 1377 the Black Prince died, but the spirit exemplified in his action of 1370 prevailed now more than ever. The practice of knighthood had degenerated into a stupid pageantry. The old order was breaking up, with all the usual symptoms produced by the working of unrecognized forces. And in the church, too, corruption was reaping an unpleasant harvest. Wycliffe was a portentous symbol, and the connection O tilde Napian S one on Y greater than a Y Nan B O US peasant S. However much Wycliffe may have disapproved as no accident. Against such a background the characters of the knight, the parson and the plowman seem like nostalgic idealizations, and perhaps Chaucer meant them as such. For the rest, he takes men as he finds them, obtaining that kind of amusement in the ironic yet sympathetic observation of his fellows which yields itself only to the artist's vision. The social and economic background, with its confusions and upheavals, is transmuted through human character into individual examples of self-interest or rascality, portrayed with that relish for human behavior and human weakness that W.L. finds so often in Shakespeare. But we must not, as some critics have tended to do, lay down Chaucer's irony. A high proportion of his pilgrims are rascals, and Chaucer knows that they are. Nor can we ignore his clear attack on corruption in the church. Though here again the attack is done obliquely through the presentation of individual characters. The monk and the friar and the summoner are amusing enough characters as Chaucer describes them. But the behavior of the latter two, brilliantly presented and magnificently comic though it is the behavior of petty blackguards, while the pardoner, perhaps Chaucer's greatest masterpiece of character drawing, implies a whole world of moral hypocrisy. Chaucer's point of view is secular throughout in spite of evidence of his genuine religious feeling and of the famous retraction which follows the parson's tale in the manuscripts, and he is intrigued rather than shocked by the weaknesses of human nature. But irony always has moral implications, and Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales was not an Ionist for nothing. Attempts have been made to identify some of the pilgrims with historical characters. But even if this could be done, it adds nothing to our view of Chaucer's achievement. He gives us a collection of individuals who also represent the different social and professional strata of the England of his day. The Church, with its many representatives, for the Church was the dominant profession in the Middle Ages, the knight and his son the squire representing the upper classes but not the high aristocracy. The merchant represents the well-to-do middle classes, and the 5 members of trade guilds also middle class, the franklin, a non-aristocratic Londoner, the yeoman, independent but lower down in the social scale, professional men such as the sergeant of the law and the doctor of physic, executive or managerial characters such as the man supple who purchased provisions for an inn of court and the reeve assistant manager of an estate, and so on down to the ploughman. Almost all have more characteristics than their representative capacities demand, the tales they tell and the incidents in which they become involved. And let us work in thriftily by cortisol, body that WOL nat I for WO I speak or use go my way or a house answered. Tell on, a devil WEYL thou art a fool. Thy wit is overcome, now hearkeneth quod the Maya, I'll and some. But first I make a protest ratio that I am drunk, I know it by my son, and the for if that I'm speaker ca. Write at the L of Southwark, I you pray. For I WOL tell a legend and IYF both of a carpenter and of his WYF. How that a clerk heart set the riderless cappy, the reeve whose duties apparently also involved carpentering, took offence, and protested violently at the miller's lewd drunken harlotry. It is a sin and eke a great folly to appear in any man or hym defame and to bring gen wives in such fame. Thou mayst hear no of others thunders sane, but the miller persists and tells his cause and rollicking fably or about a credulous carpenter and his pretty wife, who cuckolded him with an ingenious and personable young clerk. The company laugh, and Oswald the reeve, who was of carpenter's craft, felt somewhat annoyed. He could requite the miller with a bawdy story of blaring of a proud miller's but he is getting old and his days of play are over. With a sudden yet wholly appropriate change of mood, Chaucer has the reeve burst into an eloquent self-pitying account of his growing old, using the images appropriate to his daily work. Physically, when I was born anon deet drof the tapi of IYF and leet it gone, and ever sit behat so the tapi here until that almost all empty is the ton. But he finds the energy to requite the miller with another cause tale of the fably variety of how a crook the miller had his wife and daughter seduced by a couple of Cambridge students. His conclusion shows his satisfaction, and God that sitteth in majesty, save this company great and small, thus have I quit the mayor in my tale. The reeve's tale sends the cook into rows of laughter, and he begins a tale of his own, evidently in similar vein, as far as we can tell from the 60 lines of it that alone are extant. The man of law's tale comes in the manuscripts after the unfinished cook's tale, preceded by the words of the host to the companion, and followed by further talk. It is clearly a separate fragment of the whole work. This tale is in quite different vein from that of the millers or the reeves. Told in rhyme royal, it is a symbolic story of the manifold misfortunes of Constance, daughter of a Roman emperor, and her final delivery from woe after a series of tribulations sufficient, as in the case of patient Griselda of the Clerk's Tale, to drive most people out of their minds. The whole thing has the dream quality of so much medieval pseudo-history. Its source is Nicholas Trivets' Anglo-Norman Chronicle and may well be an earlier work. The characters are figures in a tapestry, and while the tale has a certain formal beauty, it lacks complexity and life.